Hello and welcome. In this video, I'm going to take a look at the absolute value function and just give you a little bit of information about it and a few main properties. So what is the absolute value function? Well, the absolute value function we write as two vertical bars around a number. And let's say that a is some real number. Now, you may be familiar with the absolute value function as being an operation that always takes a value and makes it positive. But is a better way to think about it. It does one of two things depending on the real number a. So we're going to break this into two different rules essentially. Now imagine that that number a is already positive, then the absolute value will leave it alone. And now the same thing also holds true if a is equal to 0, then the absolute value will leave it alone. So we'll leave a little break here. If a is greater than or equal to 0, in that case, the absolute value of a is simply equal to the number a. Now, if a is a number that is negative, then what we have to do is find some sort of operation that we already have that would then change a negative number into a positive number. So what operation do we have that changes the sign of something? Well, that's called negating. If we negate a positive, we get a negative. If we negate a negative, then we get a positive. So we use this other clause here, if a is less than 0, and we already have a negative number, then we can negate a, and negating a negative will result in a positive. So it might be a little bit silly looking when I say negative a. I don't mean that I get a negative number. I mean that when I take a negative value a and I negate it, then I get the result, and that should be positive. Okay, so that's a definition for a. Here's another way to actually view it. We use absolute values all the time when we talk about distance. We can look at the real number line. And on the real number line, we could put 0 on there as being kind of an important marker on the real number line. And then you can start making tick marks for 1, 2, 3, and all of the natural numbers, or -1, -2, -3, and start including all the negative integers. Now, what if we were to put a dot somewhere on this real number line, and let's say we wanted to put that at the number 4? How far is 4 from 0? Well, we would take a look, and it would be total distance here of 4 units. And it doesn't matter if you're counting from 4 down to 0 or 0 up to 4, we just say that the distance is 4 units. Now, if I take a negative number and I look at -2, how far away from 0 is -2? If we're just talking about distance, then it's just simply 2 units. And that is precisely what the absolute value can be used for, because the absolute value of -2 is equal to the distance from -2 to 0, and the absolute value of 4 is equal to the distance from 0 to 4. So any real number that we like, if you take its absolute value, you can just think about that as being the distance between that number and 0. And distance is always positive. Now, there are a few main properties of absolute values that are good to know. Let's look at 5 properties. And the first one is probably the most obvious, and we were talking about that when we look at distance. Distance is always positive, but distance could be 0. So as a result, the absolute value of any real number is always greater than or equal to 0. You can't have a negative result. So that would mean that you could get the absolute value of 0 equals 0, but the absolute value of any other number other than 0 is always positive. Okay, so the second property, if you think about it, there's always two numbers that are equidistant from 0. So 4 is 4 units from 0, but -4 is also 4 units from 0. Likewise, -2 is 2 units away from 0, and so is +2. They have exactly the same distance. So thinking about it maybe in terms of distance, the absolute value of a is also equal to the absolute value of -a or negated a. So whether or not a is on the left-hand side of the real number line, so maybe a is a negative number, in which case negated a is a positive number, or maybe a is a positive number, negated a is a negative number. In either case, you'll end up with a negative and a positive, and you can say that they are equidistant from zero. Third property, if I have two numbers and I multiply them together, and then I take the absolute value, we know the result is going to be a positive number. It's just as good to take the absolute value of each individual factor, and then you'll end up with two positive numbers, and then multiply them. Likewise, this works with division. A divided by b, and then taking the absolute value, you'll know that the result should be positive. So it's just as easy to take the absolute value of a, and take the absolute value of b, and then divide them in a different order like that. Just as long, of course, as b is not equal to 0, because we don't want to divide by 0. Now the last property is a little bit less intuitive. You can try this out by using a few examples, and you'll see that it's true. But in order to prove it, will be a little bit more advanced than what we would like to cover in this course. It's an inequality. Rather than an equals sign, this is going to use a less than or equal to sign. The absolute value of a plus b is less than or equal to the absolute value of a plus the absolute value of b. All right, so it's not quite as easy with addition or subtraction. You can see that rule number 3 and rule number 4 allow you to break apart factors and then take individual absolute values of individual factors. But if you have two terms added together, it's not an equal sign. The absolute value of a plus b is not necessarily equal to the absolute value of a plus the absolute value of b. The strongest thing that we can say is that the absolute value of a plus b is always less than or equal to the absolute value of a plus the absolute value of b. That last one you have to be a little bit careful of. Since it's not an equal sign, you can't just simply replace the absolute value on the left-hand side with the absolute values on the right. Now those are the main things to know about the absolute value currently. We'll take another look at this when we're looking at function. Hopefully that just gives you a little bit better idea of the absolute value. Rather than just thinking about it as an operation that makes things positive, you can also start to think about it as the distance away from the origin 0. That's it for now. I'll see you in the next video.